darkness, though once again it seemed that she stayed still and the pinpoint of light grew to a glowing pearl, an iridescent apple, a full moon, until it filled her vision entirely with brightness, all the world. She did not touch it, though, not yet. A space finer than a hair remained between. Ever so gently she reached across that gap. With what, lacking a body, was as much a mystery as how she knew one dream from another. Her will, the wise ones said, but she still did not understand how that could be. As though laying a finger to a soap bubble, she kept her touch very delicate indeed. The shining wall shimmered like spun glass, pulsed like a heart, delicate and alive. A little firmer touch and she would be able to see inside, see what Nynaeve was dreaming. A bit firmer still and she could actually step inside and be a part of the dream. That carried hazards, especially with anyone of a strong mind, but either looking in or stepping in could be mortifying. For example, if the dreamer happened to be dreaming of a man she was particularly interested in. Apologies alone took half the night when you did that. Or with a hooking sort of motion, like rolling a fragile bead across a tabletop, she could snatch Nynaeve out into a dream of her own making, a part of Tel'aran Riod itself, where she was in complete control. She was sure that would work. Of course, that was one of the forbidden things, and she did not think Nynaeve would appreciate it. Nynaeve, this is Egwene. Under no circumstances are you to return until you find the bowl. Not until I can settle a problem with Arena and Nicola. They know you were pretending. I will explain more when I see you next in the little tower. Be careful, Moghedien has escaped. The dream winked out. The soap bubble pricked. Despite the message, she would have giggled had she possessed a throat. A disembodied voice in your dream could have a startling effect, especially if you were afraid the speaker might be peeking. Nynaeve was not one to forget, even when it was an accident. That light-spangled sea whirled about her once more until she settled on another sparkling pinpoint, Elaine. The two women very likely slept no more than a dozen paces apart in Ebu Dar, but distance had no meaning here, or perhaps it had a different meaning. This time, when she delivered her message, the dream pulsed and changed. It still appeared exactly the same as every other, but even so, to her it was transformed. Had the words drawn Elaine into another dream? They would remain, however, and she would remember on waking. With Nicola and Arena's bowstrings dampened a little more, it was time to turn her attention to Rand. Unfortunately, finding his dreams would be as useless as finding an Aes Sedai's. He shielded his somewhat as they did theirs, although apparently a man's shield differed from a woman's. An Aes Sedai's shield was a crystal carapace, a seamless sphere woven of spirit, but however transparent it appeared, it might as well have been steel. She could not recall how many fruitless hours she had frittered away trying to peer through his. Where a sister's shielded dream seemed brighter close up, his were dimmer. It was like staring into muddy water. Sometimes you had the impression that something had moved deep in those gray-brown swirls, but you could never tell what. Again, the endless array of lights spun and settled, and she approached a third woman's dream, gingerly. So much lay between her and Amis that it seemed akin to approaching her mother's dreams. In truth, she had to admit, she wanted to emulate Amis in many ways. She desired Amis's respect every bit as greatly as she did the Hall's. Maybe, if she had to choose, she would choose Amis's. Certainly there was no sitter she esteemed as highly as she did Amis. Pushing away a sudden diffidence, she tried to make her voice softer, to no avail. Amis, this is Egwene. I must speak with you. We will come, a voice murmured to her, Amis's voice. Startled, Egwene backed away. She felt like laughing at herself. Perhaps it was just as well to be reminded that the wise ones had long years more experience at this. There were times she was afraid she might have been spoiled by not having to work harder for her abilities with the one power. Then again, as if to make up for it, sometimes everything else seemed like trying to climb a cliff in a rainstorm. Abruptly, she caught movement at the very edge of her field of vision. One of those points of light slid through the sea of stars, drifting toward her of its own volition, growing larger. Only one dream would do that. One dreamer. In a panic, she fled, wishing she had a throat to scream or curse or just shout, especially at the tiny corner of her that wanted to stay where she was and wait. Not even the stars moved this time. They simply disappeared, and she was leaning against a thick redstone column, panting as though she had sprinted a mile, heart beating fit to burst. After a moment, she looked down at herself and began to look at herself unsteadily, trying to catch her breath. She had on a full-skirted gown of shimmering green silk, worked in thread of gold in wide, ornate bands across the bodice and along the hem. That bodice also showed considerably more bosom than she ever would waking, and a broad cinched belt of woven gold made her waist seem smaller than it really was. Then again, maybe it was smaller. Here in Tel Riod, you could be however you wanted, whatever you wanted, even when the wanting was unconscious if you were not careful. Gawain Trakand had unfortunate effects on her, very unfortunate. That tiny part of her still wished she had waited to be overtaken by his dream, overtaken and absorbed by it. If a dream walker loved somebody to distraction, or hated them beyond reason, most especially if the emotion was returned, she could be pulled into that person's dream. She drew the dream, or it drew her, as a lodestone drew iron filings. She certainly did not hate Gawain, but she could not afford to be trapped in his dream, not tonight. Trapped until he wakened, being as he saw her, which was a good deal more beautiful than she truly was. Oddly, he appeared less beautiful than he was in life. There was no question of a strong mind or concentration when love or hate that strong was involved. Once you were in that dream, there you remained until the other person stopped dreaming about you. Remembering what he dreamed of doing with her, what they had done in his dreams, she felt a fiery blush suffusing her face. A good thing none of the sitters can see me now, she muttered. They'd never take me for anything but a girl then. Grown women did not flutter and moon over a man this way. She was certain of that. Not women with any sense, anyway. What he dreamed of would come, but at a time of her choosing. Obtaining her mother's permission might be difficult, yet surely she would not withhold it, even if she had never laid eyes on Gawain. Marin Alvir trusted her daughter's judgment. Now it was time for her youngest daughter to show a little of that judgment and put these fancies away until a better time. Looking around, she almost wished she could go on letting Gawain fill her thoughts. More massive columns ran in every direction, supporting a soaring vaulted ceiling and a great dome. None of the gilded lamps hanging from golden chains overhead was lit, yet there was light of a sort, light that was just there, without source, neither bright nor dim. The heart of the stone, inside the great fortress called the Stone of Tyr, or rather its image in Tel Riod, an image as real as the original in many ways. This was where she had met the wise ones before, their choice. A strange one for Aiel, it seemed to her. She would have expected Roydian, now that it was open, or somewhere else in the Aiel waste, or simply wherever the wise ones happened to be. Every place except Ogier Stedding had its reflection in the world of dreams. Even the Stedding did really, but they could not be entered, just as Roydian had once been closed. The Aes Sedai camp was out of the question, of course. A number of the sisters now had access to Terangreal that allowed them to enter the world of dreams, and since none really knew what they were doing, they often began their ventures by appearing in the camp of Tel Riod, as though setting out on a normal journey. Like Angreal and Saangreal, by Tower law, Terangreal were the property of the White Tower, no matter who happened to possess them for the present. Very seldom did the Tower insist, at least when possession lay somewhere like the so-called Great Holding in this very Stone of Tyr. Eventually they would come to the Aes Sedai, and the White Tower had always been good at waiting when it needed to. But those actually in Aes Sedai hands were in the gift of the hall of individual sitters. The loan, really. They were almost never given. Elaine had learned to duplicate Dream Terangreal, and she and Nynaeve had taken 2 with them, but the rest were in the hall's possession now, along with the other sorts Elaine had made. which meant that Shiriam and her little circle could use them whenever they wished, and most assuredly Lelaine and Romanda, though it was likely those two sent others instead of entering Tel'aran'rhiod themselves. Until quite recently, no Aes Sedai had walked the dream in centuries, and they still had considerable difficulties, most of which stemmed from a belief that they could learn by themselves. Even so, the last thing Egwene wanted was any of their followers spying on this meeting tonight. As though the thought of spies had made her more sensitive, she became aware of being watched by unseen eyes. That sensation was always present in Tel'aran'rhiod, and not even the wise ones knew why. But although hidden eyes always seemed to be there, actual watchers might be present as well. It was not Romanda or Lelaine on her mind now. Trailing her hand against the column, she walked all the way around it slowly, studying the redstone forest as it ran away in deepening shadows. The light surrounding her was not real. Anybody in one of those shadows would see the same light around them while shadows hid her. People did appear, men and women, flickering images that rarely lasted more than a few heartbeats. She had no interest in those who touched the world of dreams in their sleep. Anyone might do that by happenstance, but luckily for them, only for moments, seldom long enough to face any of the dangers. The Black Ajah possessed Dream ter'angreal too, stolen from the tower. Worse, Moghedien knew Tel'aran'rhiod as well as any dreamwalker. Perhaps better. She could control this place and anyone in it as easily as turning her hand. For a moment, Egwene wished she'd spied on Moghedien's dreams while the woman was prisoner, just once, just enough to be able to distinguish them. But even identifying her dreams would not reveal where she was now. And there had been the possibility of being drawn in against her will. She certainly despised Moghedien enough, and the Forsaken most assuredly hated her without bounds. What happened in there was not real, not even as real as in Tel'aran'rhiod, but you remembered it as if it was. A night in Moghedien's power would have been a nightmare she likely would have relived every time she went to sleep for the rest of her life.
Hey, D-Man, how you doing,
Maybe
bro?
awake, too.
I haven't been doing too
Another
bad.
circuit. What was that? A dark,
Same
regally
old, same
beautiful
old.
woman in pearl-covered cap and lace-ruffed gown strode from the shadows and vanished. A Tyran woman
Feeling better
dreaming,
today than
a
I
high
was
lady,
yesterday.
or dreaming herself as one. She might be plain
Didn't
and
do
dumpy,
live
a farm wife
yesterday.
or a merchant,
I was
awake.
just hurting.
Better to have spied
How
on
you been
Loghain
doing,
than
D-Man?
Moghedien. She still would not know where he was, but she might have some idea of his plans. Of course, being pulled into his dream might not have been much more pleasant than being drawn into Moghedien's. He hated all Aes Sedai. Arranging his escape had been one of those necessary things. She just hoped the price would not be too high. Forget Loghain. Moghedien was the
that
danger.
time of year when
Moghedien who might come after her, even here.
everything
Especially
gets
here.
colder and
Moghedien
makes
who...
my body start hurting.
Suddenly she became aware of how heavily she was moving, and made a vexed sound in her throat, very nearly a groan. The beautiful gown had become a full set of plate and mail armor like that of Gareth Bryn's heavy cavalry. An open-faced helmet rested on her head, with a crest in the shape of the flame of Tar Valon by the feel. It was very irritating. She was beyond this sort of lack of control. Firmly, she changed the armor to what she had worn meeting the Wise Ones before. It was just a matter of thought. Full skirt of dark wool and loose white algoda blouse, just as she had worn while studying with them, complete with a fringed shawl so green it was nearly black, and a folded headscarf to hold her hair back. She did not duplicate their jewelry, of course, all the multitudes of necklaces and bracelets. They would laugh at her for that. A woman built her collection over the years, not in the blink of a dream. Loghain is on his way to the Black Tower, she said aloud. She certainly hoped he was. At least there would be some check on him then, or so she hoped. And if he was caught and gentled again, Rand could not blame any sister following her. And Moghedien has no way of knowing where I am. That she tried to make sound a certainty. Why should you fear the shadow souled? Asked a voice behind her, and Egwene tried to climb into the air. This being Tel'aran'rhiod and she a dream walker, she was more than her own height above the floor stones before she came to herself. Very light, she thought, floating. I'm far beyond all those beginner's mistakes. If this went on, next she would be jumping when Chesa gave her good morning. Hoping she was not blushing too badly, she let herself settle slowly, so she could retain a little dignity. Perhaps, yet Bear's aged face had more creases than usual from a grin that seemed nearly to touch her ears. Unlike the other two women with her, she could not channel, but that had nothing to do with dream walking. She was as skilled as either, more in some areas. Amis was smiling too, if not so broadly, but sun-haired Mylane threw back her head and roared. I have never seen anyone, Mylane just managed to get out, like a rabbit. She gave a little hop and lifted a full pace into the air. I recently caused Mogedion some hurt. Egwene was quite proud of her poise. She liked Mylane. The woman was much less thorny since she was with child, with twins actually. But at the moment Egwene could have strangled her cheerfully. Some friends and I damaged her pride, if not much more. I think she would like the opportunity to repay me. On impulse, she changed her clothes once more to the sort of riding dress she wore every day now, in lustrous green silk. The great serpent encircled her finger with gold. She could not tell them everything, but these women were friends too, and they deserved to know what she could tell. Wounds to the pride are remembered long after wounds to the flesh. Bear's voice was thin and high, yet strong, a reed of iron. Tell us about it, Mylane said, with an eager smile. How did you shame me? Bear's was just as enthusiastic. In a cruel land, you either learned to laugh at cruelty or spent your life weeping. In the threefold land, the Aiel had learned to laugh long since. Besides, shaming an enemy was considered an art. Amis studied Egwene's new clothes for a moment, then said, That can come later, I think. We are to talk, you said. She gestured to where the wise ones liked to talk, out beneath the vast dome at the heart of the chamber. Why they chose that spot was another mystery Egwene could not puzzle out. The three women settled themselves cross-legged, spreading their skirts neatly, only a few paces from what seemed to be a sword made of gleaming crystal, rising head first from where it had been driven into the floor stones. They paid it no mind whatsoever. It was no part of their prophecies, any more than they did the people who flashed into existence around the great chamber, but here was always where they came. Fabled Kalandor would indeed function as a sword despite its appearance, but in truth it was a male Sa'angreal, one of the most powerful ever made in the age of legends. She felt a little shiver, thinking of male Sa'angreal. It had been different when there was only Rand, and the Forsaken, of course. But now there were these Ashaman. With Kalandor, a man could draw enough of the one power to level a city in a heartbeat and devastate everything for miles. She walked wide around it, holding herself aside reflexively. From the heart of the stone, Ran had drawn Kalandor in fulfillment of the prophecies, then returned it for her own reasons. Returned it and snared it round with traps woven in Saidin. They would have their reflection too, one that might trigger as decisively as the original, should the wrong weaves be tried nearby. Some things in Tel Aranriod were all too real. Trying not to think of the sword that is not a sword, Egwene placed herself before the three wise ones. Fastening their shawls around their waists, they unlaced their blouses. That was how Aiel women sat with friends, in their tents beneath the hot sun. She did not sit, and if that made her seem a supplicant or on trial, so be it. In a way, in her heart, she was. I've not told you why I was summoned away from you, and you have not asked. You will tell us when you are ready, Amis said complacently. She looked of an age with Mylane, despite hair white as Bear's tumbling to her waist. Her hair had begun turning when she was little older than Egwene, but she was the leader among the three, not Bear. For the first time, Egwene wondered just how old she was. Not a question you asked a wise one, any more than an Aes Sedai. When I left you, I was one of the accepted. You know about the division in the White Tower. Bear shook her head and grimaced. She knew, but she did not understand. None of them did. To Aiel, it was as unreal as clan or warrior society dividing against itself. Perhaps it was also affirmation in their eyes that Aes Sedai were less than they should be. Egwene went on, surprised that her voice was collected, steady.
Ugh.
The sisters who oppose Elida have raised me as their Amerlin. When Elida is pulled down, I will sit on the Amerlin seat in the White Tower.
It's got alcohol
She
all
added
over
the
me.
striped stole to her clothes and waited. Once she had lied to them, a serious transgression under J-Ito, and she was not sure how they would react to learning this truth she had hidden. If only they believed, at least. They merely looked at her. There is a thing children do, Mylene said carefully after a time. Her pregnancy did not show yet, but already she had the inner radiance, making her even more beautiful than usual, and an inward unshakable calm. Children all want to push spears, and they all want to be the clan chief. But eventually they realize that the clan chief seldom dances the spears himself. So they make a figure and set it on a rise. Off to one side, the floor suddenly mounded up, no longer stone tiles, but a ridge of sun-baked brown rock. Atop it stood a shape vaguely like a man, made of twisted twigs and bits of cloth. This is the clan chief who commands them to dance the spears from the hill where he can see the battle. But the children run where they will, and their clan chief is only a figure of sticks and rags. A wind whipped the cloth strips, emphasizing the hollowness of the shape, and then ridge and figure were gone. Egwene drew a deep breath. Of course. She had atoned for her lie, according to J-Ito, by her own choice, and that meant it was as if the lie had never been spoken. She should have known better. But they had struck to the heart of her situation, as though they had been weeks in the Aes Sedai camp. Bear studied the floor, not wanting to witness her shame. Amis sat with chin in hand, sharp blue gaze trying to dig to her heart. Some see me so. Another deep breath, and she pushed the truth out. All but a handful do. Now. By the time we finish our battle, they will know I am their chief, and they will run as I say. Return to us, Bear said. You have too much honor for these women. Sorelia already has a dozen young men picked out for you to view in the sweat tents. She has a great desire to see you make a bridal wreath. I hope she will be there when I wed, Bear. To Gawain she hoped. That she would bond him she knew from interpreting her dreams, but only hope and the certainty of love said they would wed. I hope all of you will, but I've made my choice. Bear would have argued further, and Mylene too, but Amis raised a hand and they fell silent, if not pleased. There is much G in her decision. She will bend her enemies to her will, not run from them. I wish you well in your dance, Egwene Alvir. She had been a maiden of the spear, and often thought as one still. Sit, sit. Her honor is her own, Bear said, frowning at Amis. But I have another question. Her eyes were an almost watery blue, yet when they turned on Egwene, they were sharp as ever Amis's had been. Will you bring these Aes Sedai to kneel to the Karakan? Startled, Egwene nearly fell the last foot to the floorstones, rather than sitting. There was no hesitation in her answer, though. I can't do that, Bear, and would not if I could. Our loyalty is to the Tower, to the Aes Sedai as a whole, above even the lands we were born in. That was true, or was supposed to be, though she wondered how the claim squared in their minds with her and the others' rebellion. Aes Sedai don't even swear fealty to the Amerlin, and certainly not to any man. That would be like one of you kneeling to a clan chief. She made an illustration the way Mylene had, by concentrating on its reality. Tel'aran'rhiod Riod was infinitely malleable if you knew how. Beyond Kalendor, 3 wise ones dropped to their knees before a clan chief. The man strongly resembled Ruark, the women the 3 in front of her. She only held it for an instant, but Bear glanced at it and sniffed loudly. The notion was preposterous. Do not compare those women to us. Mylene's green eyes sparkled with something very like their old sharpness. Her tone was honed like a razor. Egwene held her tongue. The wise ones seemed to despise Aes Sedai, all except her, or perhaps better to say they were contemptuous. She thought they might actually resent the prophecies that linked them to Aes Sedai. Before she had been summoned by the Hall to be raised Amerlin, Shiriam and her circle of friends had met here regularly with these three, but that had ended as much because the Wise Ones refused to hide their contempt as because Egwene finally had been called. In Tel'aran Riyadh, a confrontation with someone more familiar with the place could be mortifying in the extreme. Even with Egwene, there was a distance now, and certain matters they would not discuss, such as whatever they knew of Rand's plans. Before, she had been one with them, a student in dream-walking. After, she was Aes Sedai, even before they learned what she had just told them. Egwene Alvir will do as she must, Amis said. Mylane gave her a long look and rearranged her shawl ostentatiously, shifted several long necklaces in a clatter of ivory and gold, but said nothing. Amis seemed even more the leader than she had been. The only wise one Egwene had ever seen make other wise ones defer to her so easily was Sorillia. Bear had imagined tea before her as it might be in the tents, a golden teapot worked with lions from one country, a silver tray edged in ropework from another, tiny green cups of delicate sea-folk porcelain. The tea tasted real, of course, felt real going down. Despite a hint of some sweet berry or herb she did not recognize, it was too bitter for Egwene's tongue. She imagined a little honey in it and took another sip. Too sweet. A touch less honey. Now it tasted right. That was something you could not do with the power. Egwene doubted that anyone had the skill to weave threads of saidar fine enough to remove honey from tea. For a moment she sat peering into her teacup, thinking about honey and tea and fine threads of saidar, but that was not what held her silent. The wise ones wanted to guide Rand no less than Elida or Romanda or Lelaine, or very likely any other Aes Sedai. Of course, they only wanted to direct the Karakarn in a way that was best for the Aiel, yet those sisters wanted to direct the Dragon Reborn toward what was best for the world, as they saw it. She did not spare herself. Helping Rand, keeping him from putting himself at odds with Aes Sedai beyond recovery, those meant guiding him too. Only I'm right, she reminded herself. Whatever I do is as much for his own good as for anybody else's. None of the others ever think about what's right for him. But it was best to remember that these women were more than simply her friends and followers of the Karakarn. No one was ever simply anything, she was learning. I do not think you wished only to tell us you are now a woman chief among the Wetlanders, Amis said over her teacup. What troubles your mind, Egwene Alvin? What troubles me is what always does. She smiled to lighten the mood. Sometimes I think Rand is going to give me gray hairs before my time. Without men, no woman would have gray hairs. Normally, that would have been a joke on Mylane's tongue, and Bear would have made another over the vast knowledge of men Mylane had gained in just a few months of marriage. But not this time. All three women simply watched Egwene and waited. So, they wished to be serious. Well, Rand was serious business. She just wished she could be sure they saw it anything at all the way she did. Balancing her cup on her fingertips, she told them everything. About Rand, anyway, and her fears since learning of the silence from Caemlyn. I don't know what he's done, or what she has. Everybody tells me how experienced Mirana is, but she's had none with the likes of him. When it comes to Aes Sedai, if you hid this cup in a meadow, he'd still manage to step on it inside 3 paces. I know I could do better than Mirana, but you could return, Bear suggested again, and Egwene shook her head firmly. I can do more where I am, as Amerlin, and there are rules even for the Amerlin seat. Her mouth twisted for an instant. She did not like admitting that, especially not to these women. I can't even visit him without the Hall's permission. I'm Aes Sedai now, and I have to obey our laws. That came out more fiercely than she intended. It was a stupid law, but she had not yet found a way around it. Besides, they wore so little expression, she was sure they were snickering incredulously inside. Not even a clan chief had the right to say when or where a wise one could go. The three women across from her exchanged long looks. Then Amis set her teacup down and said, Mirana Ambre and other Aes Sedai followed the Karakarn to the Tree Killer's city. You need have no fear he will put his foot wrong with her, or any of your sisters with her. We will see that there is no difficulty between him and any Aes Sedai. That hardly sounds like Rand, Egwene said doubtfully. So Shiriam had been right about Mirana, but why was she still silent? Bear cackled with laughter. Most parents have more trouble with their children than lies between the Karakarn and the women who came with Mirana Ambre. So long as he isn't the child, Egwene chuckled, relieved that someone was amused at something. The way these women felt about Aes Sedai, they would have been spitting nails if they thought any sister was gaining influence with him. On the other hand, Mirana had to gain some, or she might as well leave now. But Mirana should have sent a report. I don't understand why she hasn't. You're certain there isn't any... She could not think of how to finish. There was no way that Rand could have stopped Mirana from sending off a pigeon. Perhaps she sent a man on a horse, Amis grimaced faintly. As much as any Aiel she found riding repugnant. Your own legs were good enough. She brought none of the birds that wetlanders use. That was foolish of her, Egwene muttered. Foolish did not come close. Mirana's dreams would be shielded, so there was no point trying to talk to her there, even if they could be found. Light, but it was vexing. She leaned forward intently. Amis, promise me you won't try to stop him from talking with her, or make her so angry she does something foolish. They were quite capable of that. More than capable. They had putting an Aes Sedai's back up perfected to a talent. She's just supposed to convince him that we mean him no harm. I'm sure Elida has some nasty surprise hidden behind her skirts, but we don't. She would see to that if anyone had different notions. Somehow she would. Promise me? They passed unreadable looks back and forth. They could not like the idea of letting a sister near Rand, certainly not unhindered. Doubtless one of them would contrive to be present whenever Mirana was, but she could live with that so long as they did not hinder too much. I promise, Egwene Alvear, Amis said finally, in a voice flat as worked stone. Probably she was offended that Egwene had required a pledge, but Egwene felt as though a weight had lifted. 2 weights. Rand and Mirana were not at each other's throats, and Mirana would have a chance to do what she'd been sent to do. I knew I'd have the unvarnished truth from you, Amis. I can't tell you how glad I am to hear it. If anything were wrong between Rand and Mirana, thank you. Startled, she blinked. For an instant, Amis wore cut-in sore. She made some sort of small gesture, too. Maiden hand talk, perhaps. Neither Bear nor Melaine, sipping their tea, gave any sign that they had noticed. Amis must have been wishing she were somewhere else, away from the tangle Rand had made of everybody's life. It would be embarrassing, shaming, for a wise one dreamwalker to lose control of herself in Tel Riyadh even for an instant. To the Aiel, shame hurt far worse than pain, but it had to be witnessed to be shame. If it was not seen, or those who saw refused to admit it, then it might as well never have happened. A strange people, but she certainly did not want to shame Amis. Composing her face, she went on as if nothing had happened. I must ask a favor, an important favor. Don't tell Rand or anybody about me. About this, I mean to say. She lifted an end of her stole. Their faces made an Aes Sedai's best calm look maniacal. Stone was not in it. I don't mean lie, she added hastily. Under Ji'ito, asking someone to lie was little better than telling one yourself. Just don't bring it up. He's already sent somebody to rescue me. And won't he be furious when he finds out I shuffled Matt off to Ebu Dar with Nynaeve and Elaine, she thought. She'd had to do it, though. I don't need rescuing, and I don't want it, but he thinks he knows better than everybody. I'm afraid he might come hunting for me himself. Which frightened her more? That he might appear in the camp alone, raging, with 300 or so Aes Sedai around him, or that he might come with some of the Ashaman. Either way, a disaster. That would be Unfortunate, Mylane murmured, though she was seldom one for understatement. And Bear muttered, the Karakarn is headstrong, as bad as any man I have ever known, and a few women for that matter. We will hold your confidence close, Egwene Alvier, Amis said gravely. Egwene blinked at the quick agreement, but perhaps it was not so surprising. To them, the Karakarn was only another chief, just more so, and wise ones had certainly been known to keep things from a chief they thought he should not know. After that, there was not much to say, though they talked a while longer over more cups of tea. She longed for a lesson in walking the dream, but could not ask with Amis there. Amis would go, and she wanted her company more than learning. The closest the wise ones came to telling her anything Rand was actually doing was when Mylane grumbled that he should finish the Shido and Savannah now, and both Bear and Amis frowned at her so she turned bright red. After all, Savannah was a wise one, as Egwene knew quite bitterly. Not even the Karakarn would be allowed to interfere with even a Shido wise one, and she could not give them details of her own circumstances. That they had leaped right to the most shaming part did nothing to lessen the shame she would feel talking about it. It was very hard not to drop back into behaving, even thinking as the Aiel did, when she was around them. For that matter, she thought it might have shamed her had she never met an Aiel, and the only sort of advice they had about dealing with Aes Sedai lately was of a nature that Elida herself would not try to follow. An Aes Sedai riot, unlikely as it sounded, might result. Worse, they already thought badly enough of Aes Sedai without her adding wood to the fire. Someday she wanted to forge a link between the Wise Ones and the White Tower, but that would never happen unless she managed to dampen that fire down. Another thing she had no idea how to do as yet. I must go, she said at last, standing. Her body lay asleep in her tent, but there was never quite enough rest in sleep while you were in Tel Eiranriod. The others rose with her. I hope you will all be very careful. Moghedien hates me, and she would certainly try to hurt anyone who's my friend. She knows a great deal about the world of dreams, at least as much as Lanfear did. That was as close as she could come to warning them without saying right out that Moghedien might know more than they. Aiel pride could be prickly. They took her meaning, though, and without offense. If the Shadow Souled meant to threaten us, Mylane said, I think they would have by now. Perhaps they believe we are no threat to them. We have glimpsed those who must be dreamwalkers, including men. Bear shook her head incredulously. No matter what she knew about the Forsaken, she considered male dreamwalkers about as common as legs on snakes. They avoid us, all of them. I think we are as strong as they, Amis added. In the one power, she and Mylane were no stronger than Theodrin and Phaelane, far from weak, indeed stronger than most Aes Sedai, but far from a Forsaken strength, too. Yet in the world of dreams, knowledge of Tel Eiranriod was often as powerful as saidar, more at times. Here, Bear was the equal of any sister. But we will take care. It is the enemy you underestimate who kills you. Egwene took Amis's hand, and Mylane's, and would have Bear's had there been a way. Instead, she included her with a smile. I'll never be able to tell you what your friendship means to me, what you mean to me. Despite everything, that was simple truth. The whole world seems to be changing every time I blink. You three are one of the few firm spots in it. The world does change, Amis said sadly. Even mountains are worn away by the wind, and no one can climb the same hill twice. I hope we will always be friends in your eyes, Egwene Alvier. May you always find water and shade. And with that they were gone, back to their own bodies. For a time she stood frowning at Kalandor, but not seeing it, until suddenly she gave herself an exasperated shake. She'd been thinking about that endless field of stars. If she waited there long, Gawyn's dream would find her again, swallow her the way his arms would shortly thereafter. A pleasant way to spend the rest of the night, and a childish waste of time. Firmly, she made herself step back to her sleeping body, but not to ordinary sleep. She never did that anymore. That one corner of her brain remained fully aware, cataloging her dreams, filing away those that foretold the future, or at any rate gave glimpses of the possible course it might take. At least she could tell that much now, though the only one she'd been able to interpret so far was the dream that told of Gawain becoming her warder. Aes Sedai called this dreaming, and the women who could do it dreamers, all long dead but her, yet it had no more to do with the one power than dream-walking did. Perhaps it was inevitable she should dream first of Gawain because she had been thinking of him. She stood in a vast, dim chamber where everything was indistinct. Everything except Gawain slowly coming toward her. A tall, beautiful man. Had she ever thought his half-brother Galad was more beautiful? With golden hair and eyes of the most wonderful deep blue. He had some distance to cover yet, but he could see her. His gaze was fixed on her like an archer's on the target. A faint sound of crunching and grating hung in the air. She looked down, and felt a scream building in her. On bare feet, Gawain walked across a floor of broken glass, shards breaking at every slow step. Even in that faint light she could see the trail of blood left by his slashed feet. She flung out a hand, tried to shout for him to stop, tried to run to him, but just that quickly she was elsewhere. In the way of dreams, she floated above a long, straight road across a grassy plain, looking down upon a man riding a black stallion. Gawain. Then she was standing in the road in front of him, and he reined in. Not because he saw her this time, but the road that had been straight now forked right where she stood, running over tall hills so no one could see what lay beyond. She knew, though. Down one fork was his violent death. Down the other, a long life and a death in bed. On one path he would marry her, on the other not. She knew what lay ahead, but not which way led to which. Suddenly he did see her, or seemed to, and smiled, and turned his horse along one of the forks. And she was in another dream, and another, and again. Not all had any bearing on the future. Dreams of kissing Gawain, of running in a cool spring meadow with her sisters the way they had as children, slid by along with nightmares, where Aes Sedai with switches chased her through endless corridors, where misshapen things lurched through shadows all around, where a grinning Nicola denounced her to the hall, and Tom Marilyn came forward to give evidence. Those she discarded, the others she tucked away, to be prodded and poked later in the hope she might understand what they meant. She stood before an immense wall, clawing at it, trying to tear it down with her bare hands. It was not made of brick or stone, but countless thousands of discs, each half white and half black, the ancient symbol of the Aes Sedai, like the 7 seals that had once held the Dark One's prison shut. Some of those seals were broken now, though not even the one power could break Quendiyar, and the rest had weakened somehow, but the wall stood strong however she beat at it. She could not tear it down. Maybe it was the symbol that was important. Maybe it was the Aes Sedai she was trying to tear down, the White Tower. Maybe... Matt sat on a night-shrouded hilltop, watching a grand illuminator's display of fireworks, and suddenly his hand shot up, seized one of those bursting lights in the sky. Arrows of fire flashed from his clenched fist, and a sense of dread filled her. Men would die because of this. The world would change. But the world was changing. It always changed. Straps at waist and shoulder held her tightly to the block, and the headsman's axe descended, but she knew that somewhere someone was running, and if they ran fast enough, the axe would stop. If not, in that corner of her mind, she felt a chill. Logain, laughing, stepped across something on the ground and mounted a black stone. When she looked down, she thought it was Rand's body he had stepped over, laid out on a funeral bier with his hands crossed at his breast. But when she touched his face, it broke apart like a paper puppet. A golden hawk stretched out its wing and touched her, and she and the hawk were tied together somehow. All she knew was that the hawk was female. A man lay dying in a narrow bed, and it was important he not die. Yet outside a funeral pyre was being built, and voices raised songs of joy and sadness. A dark young man held an object in his hand that shone so brightly she could not see what it was. On and on they came, and she sorted feverishly, desperately tried to understand. There was no rest in it, but it must be done. She would do what must be done. Chapter 11. An Oath. You asked to be wakened before the sun, Mother. Egwene's eyes popped open. She had set herself a time to wake only moments from now, and despite herself, she started back against her pillow from the face above her. Stern, through a sheen of perspiration, it was not a pleasant sight first thing in the morning. Mary's manner was perfectly respectful, but a pinched nose, a permanently downturned mouth, and dark eyes sharp with censure said she had never seen anyone half as good as they should be or pretended to be, and her flat tone turned every meaning head to heels. "I hope you slept well, Mother," she said, while her expression managed a fair accusation of sloth. Her black hair, in tight coils over her ears, seemed to pull her face painfully. The unrelieved, drab, dark gray she always wore, however it made her sweat, only added to the gloom. It was a pity she had not managed a little real rest. Yawning, Egwene rose from her narrow cot and scrubbed her teeth with salt, washed her face and hands, while Mary laid out her clothes for the day, donned stockings and a clean shift, then suffered herself to be dressed. Suffered was the word. "I fear some of these knots will pull, Mother," the cheerless woman murmured, drawing the brush through Egwene's hair, and Egwene very nearly told her she had not deliberately tangled it in her sleep. "I understand we will rest here today, Mother." Bone idleness, seethed Mary's reflection in the stand mirror. "This shade of blue will set off your coloring nicely, Mother," Mary said as she did up Egwene's buttons, her face an accusation of vanity. Filled with relief that she would have Chesa tonight, Egwene donned the stole and fled almost before the woman finished. Not even a rim of the sun showed above the hills to the east. The land humped up all around in long ridges and irregular mounds, sometimes hundreds of feet high, that often looked as though monstrous fingers had squeezed them. Shadows like twilight bathed the camp lying in one of the broad valleys between, but it was well awake in the heat that never really lifted. Smells of breakfast cooking filled the air, and people bustled about, though there was none of the rush that would have meant a day's marching ahead. White-clad novices darted about at a near run. A wise novice always carried out her chores as quickly as she could. Warders never seemed hurried, of course, but even servants carrying the morning meal to Aes Sedai appeared to stroll this morning. Well, almost, in comparison to the novices. The whole camp was taking advantage of the halt. A clatter and curses as a jack-lever slipped announced wagon rights making repairs, and a distant tapping of hammers told of farriers reshoeing horses. A dozen candle makers had their molds lined up already, and the kettles heating to melt the carefully hoarded drippings and tag ends of every candle that had been burned. More big black kettles stood on fires to boil water for baths and laundry, and men and women were heaping clothes up nearby. Egwene gave little notice to any of the activity. The thing of it was, she was certain Mary did not do it a purpose. She could not help her face. Even so, she was as bad as it would be to have Romanda for a maid. The thought made her laugh out loud. Romanda as lady's maid would have her mistress towing the line in no time. No doubt as to who would run and fetch in that pair. A gray-haired cook paused in raking coals from atop an iron oven to give her a grin of shared amusement. For a moment, anyway. Then he realized he was grinning at the Amerlin seat, not just some young woman walking by, and the grin melted crookedly as he jerked a bow before bending back to his work. If she sent Mary off, Romanda would only find a new spy, and Mary would again be starving her way from village to village. Adjusting her dress, she really had gone before the woman was quite finished. Egwene's fingers found a small linen bag, the strings tucked behind her belt. She did not have to lift it all the way to her nose to smell rose petals and a blend of herbs with a cool scent. It made her sigh. A face like a headsman's, spying for Romanda without any doubt, and trying to perform her duties as well as she could. Why were these things never easy? Approaching the tent she used as a study, many called it the Amerlin's study, as if it were rooms in the tower, a solemn satisfaction replaced worry over Mary. Whenever they halted for a day, Shiriam would be there before her with fat sheaves of petitions. A laundress imploring clemency on a charge of theft when she'd been caught with the jewelry sewn into her dress, or a blacksmith begging a testimonial for his work, which he could not use unless he intended to leave, and likely not then. A harness maker asking the Amerlin's prayers for her to give birth to a daughter. One of Lord Bryn's soldiers requesting the Amerlin's personal blessing to his wedding a seamstress. There was always a slew from older novices, appealing visits to Tiana and even extra chores. Anyone had the right to petition the Amerlin, but those in service to the tower seldom did, and never novices. Egwene suspected that Shiriam worked to dig up petitioners, something to butter the cat's paws, to keep her out of Shiriam's hair while the keeper took care of what she considered important. This morning, Egwene thought she might make Shiriam eat those petitions for her breakfast. When she entered the tent, though, Shiriam was not there, which perhaps should not have been a surprise given the night before. The tent was not empty, however. "The light illumine you this morning, Mother," Theodrin said, making a deep curtsy that set the brown fringe of her shawl swaying. She had all the fabled Domani grace, though her high-necked dress was really quite modest. Domani women were not known for modesty. "We did as you commanded, but no one saw anybody near Marigan's tent last night." "Some of the men remembered seeing Halima," Feolain added sourly, with a much briefer bend of her knees. "But aside from that, they hardly recalled whether they went to sleep." Many women disapproved of Delana's secretary, but it was her next remark that made Feolain's round face darker than usual. "We met Tiana while we were roaming about. She told us to go to bed and be quick about it." Unconsciously, she stroked the blue fringe on her shawl. New Aes Sedai almost always wore their shawls more often than they needed to, so Swan said. Giving them a smile she hoped was welcoming, Egwene took her place behind the small table. Carefully, the chair tilted for a moment anyway, until she reached down and pulled the legs straight. An edge of folded parchment peeked out from beneath the stone inkwell. Her hands twitched toward it, but she made them be still. Too many sisters saw little need for courtesy. She would not be one of those. Besides, these two had a claim on her. "I am sorry for your difficulties, daughters." Made Aes Sedai by her decree on being raised Amerlin, they faced the same predicament as she, but lacking the added shield of the Amerlin's stole, small shield that had proved. Most sisters behaved as though they were still only accepted. What went on inside the Ajahs was seldom known outside, but it was rumored that they truly had had to beg admittance, and that guardians had been named to oversee their behavior. No one had ever heard the like, but everyone took it for fact. She had done them no favor. Another thing that had been necessary, though. "I will speak to Tiana. It might do some good, for a day or an hour." "Thank you, Mother," Theodrin said, "but there is no need to bother yourself." Still, she also touched her shawl, hands lingering. "Tiana wanted to know why we were up so late," she added after a moment, "but we didn't tell her." "There was no need for secrecy, daughter." A pity they had not found a witness, though. Moghedien's rescuer would remain a shadow half glimpsed, always the most frightening sort. She glanced at the tiny corner of parchment, itching to read it. Maybe Swan had discovered something. "Thank you both." Theodrin recognized a dismissal and made her manners to go, but stopped when Feolain remained where she was. "I wish I had held the oath rod already," Feolain told Egwene in tones of frustration, "so you could know what I say is true." "This isn't the time to bother the Amerlin," Theodrin began, then folded her hands and turned her attention to Egwene. Patience blended with something else on her face. Clearly the stronger of the two in the power, she always took the lead. Yet this time she was prepared to step back. In aid of what, Egwene wondered. "It isn't the oath rod that makes a woman Aes Sedai, daughter, whatever some believed. Speak the truth to me and I will believe it." I don't like you. Fairlane's mop of dark curls swayed as she shook her head for emphasis. You must know that. You probably think I was mean when you were a novice, when you came back to the White Tower after running away. But I still believe you didn't get half the punishment you should have. Maybe my admitting it will help you know I speak the truth. It isn't as though we have no choice even now. Romanda offered to take us under her protection, and so did Lilane. They said they'd see we were tested and raised properly as soon as we returned to the tower. Her face grew angrier, and Theodrin rolled her eyes and broke in. Mother, what Fairlane is fumbling all around without getting to the point is that we didn't attach ourselves to you because we had no choice, and we didn't do it in gratitude for the shawl. She pursed her lips, as if thinking that raising them Aes Sedai in the manner Egwene had was not really a gift to inspire much gratitude. Then why? Egwene asked, leaning back. The chair shifted, but held. Fairlane jumped in before Theodrin could more than open her mouth. Because you are the Amerlin seat. She still sounded angry. We can see what happens. Some of the sisters think you're Shiriam's puppet, but most believe Romanda or Lilane tells you where and when to step. It is not right. Her face was twisted in a scowl. I left the tower because what Elida did wasn't right. They raised you Amerlin, so I am yours, if you will have me. If you can trust me without the oath rod, you must believe me. And you, Theodrin? Egwene said quickly, schooling her face. Knowing how the sisters felt was bad enough. Hearing it again was painful. I am yours too, Theodrin sighed. If you'll have me. She spread her hands disparagingly. We are not much, I know, but it looks as though we are all you have. I must admit I was hesitant, Mother. Fairlane is the one who kept insisting we do this. Frankly, she settled her shawl again unnecessarily, and her voice firmed. Frankly, I do not see how you can win out over Romanda and Lilane. But we are trying to behave as Aes Sedai, even though we aren't really, yet. We will not be that, Mother, whatever you say, until the other sisters see us as Aes Sedai, and that won't happen until we have been tested and have sworn the 3 oaths. Plucking the folded scrap of parchment out from under the inkwell, Egwene fingered it while she thought. Fairlane was the driving force behind this? That seemed as unlikely as a wolf befriending the shepherd. She suspected dislike was a mild word for what Fairlane felt for her, and the woman must know Egwene hardly saw her as a potential friend. If they had accepted either sitter's arrangement, mentioning the offer might be a good means of disarming her suspicions. Mother, Fairlane said, and stopped, looking surprised at herself. It was the first time she had addressed Egwene so. Drawing a deep breath, she went on. Mother, I know you must have a hard time believing us since we've never held the oath rod, but I wish you would stop bringing that up, Egwene said. It was well to be careful, but she could not afford to refuse every offer of help for fear of plots. Do you think everybody believes Aes Sedai because of the 3 oaths? People who know Aes Sedai know a sister can stand truth on its head and turn it inside out if she chooses to. Myself, I think the 3 oaths hurt as much as they help, maybe more. I will believe you until I learn you've lied to me, and I will trust you until you show you don't deserve it, the same way everybody else does with one another. Come to think of it, the oaths did not really change that. You still had to take a sister on trust most of the time. The oaths just made people warier about it, wondering whether and how they were being manipulated. Another thing. You two are Aes Sedai. I don't want to hear any more about having to be tested or hold the oath rod or any of it. Bad enough you have to face that nonsense without parroting it yourselves. Have I made myself clear? The 2 women standing on the other side of the table murmured hastily that she had, then exchanged long looks. This time it was Fairlane who appeared indecisive. Finally, Theodrin glided around to kneel beside Egwene's chair and kiss her ring.
1 second, Emma.
Under the light and by my hope of salvation and rebirth, I, Theodrin Dabai, swear fealty to you, Egwene Alvir, to faithfully serve and obey on pain of my life and honor. She looked at Egwene questioningly. It was all Egwene could do to nod. This was no part of Aes Sedai ritual. This was how nobles swore to ruler. Even some rulers did not receive so strong an oath. Yet no sooner had Theodrin risen with a relieved smile than Pheolane took her place. Under the light and by my hope of salvation and rebirth, I, Pheolane Orunda, all that she could have wished for and more. From many other sisters, at least, who were not just as likely to be sent to fetch another's dust cloak if the wind rose. When Pheolane finished, she remained kneeling, but stiffly upright. Mother, there is the matter of my penance. For what I said to you about not liking you, I will set it myself if you wish, but it is your right. Her voice was as rigid as her posture, yet not at all fearful. She looked ready to stare down a lion, eager to, in fact. Biting her lip, Egwene nearly laughed aloud. Keeping her face smooth took effort. Maybe they would take it for a hiccup. However much they claimed they were not really Aes Sedai, Pheolane had just proved how much of one she was. Sometimes sisters set themselves penances in order to maintain the proper balance between pride and humility. That balance was much prized, supposedly, and the only reason given, usually. But certainly none sought to have one imposed. Penance set by another could be quite harsh, and the Amerlin was supposed to be harder in this than the Adjas. Either way, though, many sisters made a haughty display of submission to the greater will of the Aes Sedai, an arrogant showing of their lack of arrogance. The pride of humility, Swan called it. She considered telling the woman to eat a handful of soap just to see her expression. Pheolane had a mean tongue. But instead, I don't hand out penance for telling the truth, daughter, or for not liking me. Dislike to your heart's content, so long as you keep your oath. Not that anyone except a dark friend would break that particular oath. Still, there were ways around almost anything, but weak sticks were better than none when you were fending off a bear. Pheolane's eyes widened, and Egwene sighed as she motioned the woman to rise. Had their positions been reversed, Pheolane would have put her nose firmly in the dust. I'm setting you 2 tasks to begin, daughters, she went on. They listened carefully, Pheolane not even blinking, Theodrin with a thoughtful finger to her lips. And this time when she dismissed them, they said, As you command, mother, in unison as they curtsied. Egwene's good mood was fleeting, though. Mary arrived with her breakfast on a tray as Theodrin and Pheolane departed, and when Egwene thanked her for the rose-petal pomander, she said, I had a few spare moments, mother. By her expression, that could have been an accusation that Egwene worked her too hard, or that she herself did not work hard enough. Not a pleasant spice for the stewed fruit. For that matter, the woman's face might sour the mint tea and turn the warm, crusty bun hard as a rock. Egwene sent her away before eating. The tea was weak, anyway. Tea was one of the things in short supply. The note that had been under the inkwell proved no better seasoning. Nothing of interest in the dream, said Swan's fine script. So Swan had been in Tel Riyadh last night, too. She did a good deal of spying there. It mattered little whether she had been hunting some sign of Moghedien, though that would have been insanely foolish, or something else. Nothing was nothing. Egwene grimaced, and not just for the nothing. Swan in Tel Riyadh last night meant a visit from Lyanna sometime today, complaining. Swan most definitely no longer was allowed any of the dream ter'angreal, not since she had tried to teach some of the other sisters about the world of dreams. It was not so much that she knew little more than they, or even that few sisters believed they actually needed a teacher to learn anything, but Swan possessed a tongue like a rasp and no patience. Usually she managed to hold her temper, but 2 outbursts of shouting and fist-shaking, and she had been fortunate just to find herself denied access to the ter'angreal. Lyanna was given one whenever she asked, though, and frequently Swan used it in secret. That was one of the few real bones of contention between them. Both would have been in Tel Riyadh every night if they could. With a grimace, Egwene channeled the tiniest spark of fire to set a corner of the parchment alight, and held it until it burned nearly to her fingers. Nothing left to be found by anyone rooting through her belongings, and reported where it would rouse suspicions. Breakfast almost done, she was still alone, and that was not usual. Shiriam might well be avoiding her, but Swan should have been there. Popping a last bit of the bun into her mouth and washing it down with a final swallow of tea, She rose to go find her, only to have the object of her intended search stalk into the tent. Had Swan had a tail, she would have been lashing it. "Where have you been?" Egwene demanded, weaving a ward against listeners. "Aeldine pulled me out of my blankets first thing," Swan growled, dropping onto one of the stools. "She still thinks she'll pump the Amerlin's eyes and ears out of me. No one gets that. No one." When Swan had first arrived in Salidar, a stilled woman on the run, a deposed Amerlin the world thought dead, the sisters might well not have let her stay, except that she knew not only the Amerlin seat's network of agents, but also that of the Blue Aja, which she had run before being raised to the stole. That had given her a certain influence, just as Lyanna's agents inside Tar Valon had given her some. The arrival of Aeldine Stonebridge, who had taken her place with the blue eyes and ears, had changed matters for Swan. Aeldine had been outraged that reports from the handful of blue agents Swan had managed to reach had been handed to women outside the Aja. That Aeldine's own position had been revealed. Only 2 or 3 sisters were supposed to know, even within the blue, infuriated her to near apoplexy. She not only snatched back control of the blue network, not only upbraided Swan in a voice that might have been heard a mile off, she very nearly went for Swan's throat. Aeldine was from an Andorran mining village in the Mountains of Mist, and it was said her crooked nose came from fighting with her fists when she was a girl. Aeldine's actions had started others thinking. Egwene returned to her unsteady chair and pushed her breakfast tray aside. "Aeldine won't take it away from you, Swan, and neither will anyone else." When Aeldine reclaimed the blue eyes and ears, others had begun thinking that the blue should not have the Amerlins as well. No one suggested that it should be in Egwene's control. The Hall was to have it, so Ramonda said, and Lelaine. Each intended to be the one in charge, of course, the one those reports came to first, for being first to know had advantages. Aeldine thought those agents should be added to the blue network since Swan was blue. At least Shiriam was content simply to be handed all the reports Swan received, which she usually was. They can't make you give it up. Egwene filled her teacup again, setting it and the blue-glazed honey pot on the corner of the table nearest Swan, but the other woman only stared at them. The anger had gone out of her. She slumped on the stool. "You never really think about strength," she said, half to herself. "You're aware of it, whether you're stronger than somebody else, but you don't think about it. You just know that she defers to you or you to her. There was no one stronger than me before. No one since." Her eyes dropped to her hands, stirring uneasily on her lap. "Sometimes when Ramonda is hammering at me or Lelaine, it suddenly hits me like a gale. They're so far above me now, I should be holding my tongue until they give me permission to speak. Even Aeldane is, and she's no more than middling." She forced her head upright, mouth tight and voice bitter. "I suppose I'm adjusting to reality. That's ingrained in us too, driven deep before you ever test for the shawl, but I don't like it. I don't." Egwene picked up her pen from beside the inkwell and the sand jar, fiddling with it while she chose words. "Swan, you know how I feel about what needs to be changed. There's too much we do because Aes Sedai have always done it that way. But things are changing. No matter who believes it will all go back to how it was. I doubt anyone else was ever raised Amerlin without being Aes Sedai first." That should have elicited a comment on the White Tower's hidden records. Swan often said there was nothing that had not occurred at least once in the Tower's history, though this did seem to be a first. But Swan sat there disheartened, like a sack. "Swan, the Aes Sedai way isn't the only way, and not even always the best. I intend to make sure we follow the best way, and whoever can't learn to change, or won't, had better learn to live with it." Leaning across the table, she tried to make her expression encouraging. "I never did figure out how wise ones determine precedence, but it isn't strength in the power. There are women who can channel who defer to women who can't. One, Cerelia, would never have made it to accept it, yet even the strongest jump when she says toad." "Wilders," Swan said dismissively, but it lacked force. "Aes Sedai, then. I wasn't raised Amerlin because I am the strongest. The wisest women are chosen for the hall or to be ambassadors or advisors, the most skillful anyway, not those with the most strength. Best not to say skillful in what, though Swan certainly possessed those particular skills too. The hall? The hall might send me for tea. They might have me sweep out when they've finished sitting. Sitting back, Egwene threw down the pen. She wanted to shake the woman. Swan had kept going when she could not channel at all, and now her knees began to fold? Egwene was on the point of telling her about Theodrin and Phaelane. That should get some rise and approval, when she saw an olive-skinned woman ride past the open tent flaps, looking lost in thought beneath the wide gray hat she wore to keep off the sun. "Swan, it's Mirella." Letting the ward go, she rushed outside. "Mirella!" she called. Swan needed a victory to wash the taste of being bullied out of her mouth, and this might be just the thing. Mirella was one of Shiriam's lot, and apparently with a secret all her own. Reining in her sorrel gelding, Mirella looked around and gave a start when she saw Egwene. By her expression, the Green Sister had not realized what part of the camp she was passing through. A thin dust cloak hung down the back of her pale gray riding dress. "Mother," she said hesitantly, "if you will forgive me, I will not forgive you," Egwene cut in, making her flinch. Any doubt vanished that Mirella had heard about last night from Shiriam. "I will talk with you. Now." Swan had come outside, too, but instead of watching the sister climb uneasily from her saddle, she stared down the rows of tents toward a stocky, graying man with a battered breastplate strapped over his buff-colored coat, leading a tall bay in their direction. His presence was a surprise. Lord Bryn usually communicated with the hall by messenger, and his rare visits mostly finished before Egwene learned he had come. Swan assumed such a look of Aes Sedai serenity, it nearly made you forget her youthful face. Glancing briefly at Swan, Bryn made a leg, handling his sword with a spare grace. A weathered man, he was only moderately tall, but the way he carried himself made him seem taller. There was nothing flashy about him. The sweat on his broad face made him seem to be about a job of work. "Mother, may I speak with you? Alone?" Mirella turned as if to go, and Egwene snapped, "You stay right there, right where you are!" Mirella's mouth dropped open. Her surprise seemed as much for her own obedience as Egwene's decisive tone, and it faded into bitter resignation that she quickly hid behind a cool facade, one belied by the way she twiddled her reins. Bryn did not even blink, though Egwene was sure he at least had an inkling of her situation. She suspected that very little surprised him or unsettled him. Just the sight of him had made Swan ready to fight back. For all, it was apparently she who started most of their arguments. Already her fists rested on her hips and her gaze was fixed on him, an auguring stare that should have made anyone uneasy, even had it not come from an Aes Sedai. Mirella offered more than helping Swan, though, perhaps. "I intended to ask you to come this afternoon, Lord Bryn. I ask now." She had questions to put to him. "We can talk then, if you will forgive me." Instead of accepting her dismissal, he said, "Mother, one of my patrols found something just before dawn. Something I think you should see for yourself. I can have an escort ready and—" "No need for that," she broke in quickly. "Mirella, you will come with us. Swan, would you ask someone to bring my horse, please? Without delay." Riding out with Mirella would be better than confronting her here, if Swan's patched-together clues really pointed at anything, and on a ride she could ask Bryn her questions, but neither fueled her haste. She had just spotted Lelaine striding toward her through the tent rows, Takima at her side. With one exception, all the women who had been sitters before Swan was deposed had drifted to either Lelaine or Romanda. Most of the newly chosen sitters went their own way, which was slightly better in Egwene's view. Just slightly. Even at a little distance, the set of Lelaine's shoulders was evident. She looked ready to walk through whatever got in her way. Swan saw her as well and darted off without pausing for so much as a curtsy. Yet there was no time to make a clean escape. short of leaping onto Lord Bryn's horse. Lelaine planted herself in front of Egwene, but it was Bryn she fixed with eyes sharp as tacks, considering, calculating what he was doing there. She had larger fish to put on the fire, though. "I must speak with the Amerlin," she said peremptorily, pointing toward Mirella. "You will wait. I will talk to you after." Bryn bowed, not too deeply, and led his horse where she pointed. Men who had any brains at all soon learned arguments did little good with Aes Sedai, and with sitters the tally was usually none. Before Lelaine could open her mouth, Romanda was suddenly there, radiating command so strongly that at first Egwene did not even notice Varalin with her, and the slender red-haired sitter for the Grey was inches taller than most men. The only surprise was that Romanda had not appeared sooner. She and Lelaine watched one another like hawks, neither allowing the other near Egwene alone. The glow of Saidar surrounded both women at the same instant, and each wove a ward around the five of them to stop eavesdropping. Their eyes clashed, challenging in faces utterly cool and collected, but neither let her ward drop. Egwene bit her tongue. In a public place, it was up to the strongest sister present to decide whether a conversation should be warded, and protocol said the Amerlin made that decision wherever she was present. She had no desire for the not-quite apologies mentioning it would bring, though. If she pressed, they would accede, of course, while behaving as though soothing a petulant toddler. She bit her tongue and boiled inside. Where was Swan? That was not fair. Getting horses saddled required more than moments, but she wanted to grip her skirts to keep her hands away from her head. Romanda dropped the staring match first, though not in defeat. She rounded on Egwene so suddenly that Lelaine was left staring past her and looking foolish. "Delana is making trouble again." Her high-pitched voice was almost sweet, but it held a sharpness that emphasized the lack of any title of respect. Romanda's hair was completely gray, gathered in a neat bun on the nape of her neck, but age had certainly not softened her. Takima, with her long black hair and aged ivory complexion, had been almost 9 years a brown sitter, as forceful in the hall as in the classroom, yet she stood a meek pace back, hands folded at her waist. Romanda led her faction as firmly as Cerelia. She was one to whom strength was indeed all important, and in
Give me
truth
one
Lelaine
second,
seemed
everyone.
not far behind. "She plans to lay a proposal before the hall," Lelaine put in sourly, refusing to look at Romanda at all now. Agreeing with the other woman certainly pleased her as little as speaking second. Aware that she had gained an edge, Romanda smiled, a faint curving of her lips. "About what?" Egwene asked, playing for time. She was certain she knew. It was very hard not to sigh. It was very hard not to rub her temples. "Why, the Black Aja, of course, Mother," Varalin replied, lifting her head as if surprised at the question. Well, she might be. Delana was rabid on the subject. "She wants the hall to condemn Elida openly as black." She stopped abruptly when Lelaine raised a hand. Lelaine allowed her followers more leeway than Romanda, or maybe she just did not have as tight a grip. "You must speak with her, Mother." Lelaine had a warm smile when she chose to use it. Swan said they had been friends once. Lelaine had accepted her back with some version of welcome, yet Egwene thought that smile a practiced tool. And say what? Her hands ached to soothe her head. These two each made sure the hall passed only what she wanted, certainly little that Egwene suggested, with the result that nothing much at all was passed, and they wanted her to intercede with the sitter. Delana did support her proposals, true, when they suited her. Delana was a weather vane, turning with the last breath of air to pass, and if she turned in Egwene's direction a great deal of late, it did not mean very much. The Black Aja seemed her only fixed point. What was keeping Swan? "Tell her she must stop, Mother." Lelaine's smile and tone made her seem to be counseling a daughter. "This foolishness, worse than foolishness, has everyone at daggers' points. Some of the sisters are even beginning to believe, Mother. It will not be long before the notion spreads to the servants and the soldiers." The look she directed toward Bryn was full of doubt. Bryn appeared to be attempting to chat with Mirella, who was staring at the warded group and running her reins uneasily through her gloved hands. Believing what is plain is hardly foolish, Romanda barked. Mother, in her mouth, that sounded entirely too much like girl. The reason Delana must be stopped is she does no good and considerable harm. Perhaps Elida is black, though I have strong doubts, whatever second-hand gossip that trollop Halima brought. Elida is wrong-headed to a fault, but I cannot believe her evil. Yet even if she is, trumpeting it will make outsiders suspicious of every Aes Sedai and drive the black into deeper hiding. There are methods to dig them out if we don't frighten them into flight. Lelane's sniff bordered on a snort. Even were this nonsense true, no self-respecting sister would submit to your methods, Romanda. What you've suggested is close to being put to the question. Egwene blinked in confusion. Neither Swan nor Lyanna had brought her a whisper of this. Luckily, the sitters were not paying her enough mind to notice, as usual. Planting her fists on her hips, Romanda squared around on Lelaine. Desperate days demand desperate actions. Some might ask why anyone would put her dignity ahead of exposing the Dark One's servants. That sounds dangerously near an accusation, Lelaine said, eyes narrowing. Romanda was the one smiling now, a cold, flinty smile. I will be the first to submit to my methods, Lelaine, if you are the second. Lelaine actually growled, taking half a step toward the other woman, and Romanda leaned toward her, chin thrust out. They looked ready to begin pulling hair and rolling in the dirt, and Aes Sedai dignity be hanged. Varalin and Takima glared at one another like two maidservants supporting their mistresses, a long-legged wading bird in a scowling match with a wren. The whole lot of them seemed to have forgotten Egwene entirely. Swan came running up in a broad straw hat, leading a fat dun mare with white-stockinged hind legs, and skidded to a halt when she saw the warded gathering. One of the grooms was with her, a lanky fellow in a long frayed vest and a patched shirt, holding the reins of a tall roan. The wards were invisible to him, but Saidar did not hide the faces. His eyes went very wide, and he began licking his lips. For that matter, passers-by walked wide around the tent and pretended to see nothing. Aes Sedai, warders, and servants alike. Bryn alone frowned and studied them as though wondering what was hidden from his ears. Mirella was retying her saddlebags, plainly on the point of leaving. When you have decided what I should say, Egwene announced, then I can decide what to do. They really had forgotten her. All four stared at her in amazement as she walked between Romanda and Lelaine and out through the doubled wards. There was nothing to feel as she brushed by the weave, of course. They had never been made to stop anything as solid as a human body. When she scrambled onto the roan, Mirella drew a deep breath and emulated her in resignation. The wards had vanished, though the glow still enveloped the two sitters, each more the image of frustration than the other as they stood watching. Hurriedly, Egwene donned the thin linen dust cloak that had been draped in front of her gelding's saddle and the riding gloves that were tucked into a small pocket in the cloak. A wide-brimmed hat hung from the saddle's high pommel, deep blue to match her dress, with a spray of white plumes pinned slanting across the front that shouted of Chase's hand. Heat she could ignore, but the glare of the sun was another matter. Removing plumes and pin, she tucked them into the saddlebags, put the hat on her head, and tied the ribbons beneath her chin. "Shall we go, Mother?" Bryn asked. He was already mounted, the helmet that had been hanging from his saddle now obscuring his face behind steel bars. It looked quite natural on him, as though he had been born for armor. She nodded. There was no attempt to stop them. Lelaine would not stoop to shouting halt in public, of course, but Romanda... Egwene felt a sense of relief as they rode away, yet her head seemed to be splitting. What was she to do about Delana? What could she do? The main road in this area, a wide stretch of dirt packed so hard nothing could raise dust from it, ran through the army's camp and along the gap between that and the Aes Sedai's. Bryn angled across it, through the rest of the army on the other side. Although the army camp held 30 times or more as many people as the Aes Sedai camp, there seemed to be few more tents than for the sisters and those who served them, all scattered out across the flats and up the hillsides. Most of the soldiers slept in the open. But then it was hard to remember the last time rain had fallen, and there certainly was not a cloud to be seen. Strangely, there were more women than in the sisters' camp, though they seemed fewer at first glance among so many men. Cooks tended kettles, and laundresses attacked great heaps of clothing, while some worked with the horses or wagons. A fair number appeared to be wives. At least they sat about knitting or darning dresses or shirts, or stirring small cookpots. Armorers had set up almost anywhere she looked, hammers making steel ring on their anvils, and fletchers adding arrows to bundles by their feet, and farriers checking horses. Wagons of every sort and size stood everywhere, hundreds, perhaps thousands. The army seemed to scoop up every one it found along its path. Most of the foragers were already out, but a few high-wheeled carts and lumbering wagons still trundled away in search of farms and villages. Here and there, soldiers raised a cheer as they rode by. Lord Bryn, and the bull, the bull. That was his sigil. Nothing about Aes Sedai or the Amerlin Sea. Egwene twisted around in her couch to make sure Mirella was still close behind. She was, letting her horse follow on its own, a far-off, slightly sickly expression on her face. Swan had taken a position at the rear, shepherd to their lone sheep. Then again, she might just have been afraid to urge her mount ahead. The dun was positively a butterball, but Swan would probably treat a pony like a warhorse. Egwene felt a stab of irritation at her own animal. His name was Daishar, glory in the old tongue. She would much rather be riding Bella, a shaggy little mare not much slimmer than Swan's dun that she had ridden out of the 2 rivers. Sometimes she thought she must look a doll, perched atop a gelding that could be taken for a warhorse, but the Amerlin had to have a proper mount. No shaggy cart horses. Even if this rule was of her own making, she felt as confined as a novice. Turning in the saddle, she said, "Do you expect any opposition ahead, Lord Bryn?" He glanced at her sideways. She had asked the same once before, leaving Salidar, and twice while crossing Altara. Not enough to rouse suspicions, she thought. Murundi is like Altara, Mother. Neighbor too busy scheming against neighbor or outright fighting him to band together for anything short of a war, and not to any great degree then. His tone was very dry. He had been Captain General of the Queen's Guards in Andor, with years of border skirmishes against the Mirandians behind him. Andor will be another matter, I fear. I'm not looking forward to that. He turned another way, climbing a gentle slope to avoid 3 wagons rumbling over rocks in the same direction. Egwene tried not to grimace. Andor. Before, he had just said no. These were the tail end of the Cumbar Hills, somewhat south of Lugard, the capital of Murundi. Even if they were lucky, the border of Andor lay at least 10 days ahead. And when we reach Tarvalin, Lord Bryn, how do you plan to take the city? No one has asked me that yet, Mother. She had only thought his voice was dry before. Now it was dry. By the time we reach Tarvalin, the light willing, I'll have 2 or 3 times as many men as I do now. Egwene winced at the idea of paying so many soldiers. He did not seem to notice. With that, I will lay siege. The hardest part will be finding ships, and sinking them to block North Harbor and South Harbor. The harbors are as much the key as holding the bridge towns, Mother. Tarvalin is larger than Cairhien and Caemlin together. Once food stops going in, he shrugged. Most of soldiering is waiting, when it isn't marching. And if you don't have that many soldiers? She had never thought of all those people going hungry, women and children. She had never really thought of anyone being involved except the Aes Sedai and the soldiers. How could she have been so foolish? She had seen the results of war in Cairhien. Bryn seemed to take it so lightly. But then he was a soldier. Privation and death must be every day to soldiers. What if you only have, say, what you do now? Siege? Apparently some of what they had been saying had finally broken into whatever Mirella was thinking. She booted the sorrel forward, making a number of men jump aside, some falling on their faces. A few opened their mouths angrily, then saw her ageless features and shut their jaws again, glowering. They might as well not have existed for all of her. Arthur Hawkwing besieged Tarvalon for 20 years and failed. Abruptly, she realized ears were about and lowered her voice, but it was still acid. Do you expect us to wait 20 years? That acid washed over Gareth Bryn without leaving a stain. Would you prefer a direct assault right off, Mirella Sedai? He could have been asking whether she wanted her tea sweet or bitter. Several of Hawkwing's generals tried, and their men were slaughtered. No army has ever managed to breach Tarvalon's walls. That was not strictly true, Egwene knew. In the Trolloc Wars, an army of Dreadlord-led Trollocs had actually plundered and burned a part of the White Tower itself. At the end of the War of the Second Dragon, an army trying to rescue Gwere Amalasan before he was gentled had reached the tower too. Mirella could not know, though, much less Bryn. Access to those secret histories hidden deep in the tower library was set out in a law that was itself secret, and revealing the existence of either records or law was treason. Swan said if you read between the lines, you found hints of things that had not been recorded even there. Aes Sedai were very good at hiding truth when they thought it necessary, even from themselves. With 100,000, or what I have now, Bryn continued, I will be the first, if I can block the harbors. Hawkwing's generals never managed that. The Aes Sedai always raised those iron chains in time to stop the ships getting into the harbor mouth, and sank them before they could be placed to hinder trade. Food and supplies got in. It will come to your assault eventually, but not until the city's weakened, if I have my way. His voice was still ordinary, a man discussing an outing. His head turned toward Mirella, and though his tone did not change, the intensity in his eyes was evident even behind his face guard. And you all agreed I would when it came to the army. I won't throw men away. Mirella opened her mouth, then closed it slowly. Plainly she wanted to say something, but did not know what. They had given their word, she and Shiriam and those who had been running things when he appeared in Salidar, however much giving it galled. However much the sitters tried to get round it. They had given no word. Bryn acted as though they had, though, and so far he had managed to get away with it. So far. Egwene felt ill. She had seen war. Images flashed in her head, men fighting, killing their way through the streets of Tarvalon, dying. Her eyes fell on a square-jawed fellow chewing his tongue while he sharpened a pikehead. Would he die in those streets? The grizzled, balding man running his fingers so carefully down each arrow before sliding the shaft into his quiver. And there, that lad swaggering in his high riding boots. He looked too young to see. Light. So many were born. How many would die? For her. For justice. For the right. For the world. But at the heart, for her. Swan raised her hand, but did not complete the gesture. Had she been close enough, she could not pat the Amerlin seat on the shoulder where everyone could see. Egwene straightened her back. Lord Bryn, she said in a tight voice, what is it you want me to see? She thought he half glanced at Mirella before answering. Better you see it for yourself, Mother. Egwene thought her head might break open. If Swan's clues led to anything at all, she might just skin Mirella. If they did not, she might skin Swan. And she might throw Gareth Bryn in for good measure. Chapter 12. A Morning of Victory. The covered hills and ridges surrounding the camp showed every sign of the drought and unseasonable heat. The unholy heat, in truth. Even the dullest scullion scrubbing pots saw the Dark One's touch on the world. The true forest lay behind them to the west, but twisted oaks grew out of the rocky slopes, sour gums and pines of unfamiliar shape, and trees Egwene had no names for, brown and yellow and bare-branched, not winter bare or brown, starved for moisture and coolness, dying if the weather did not change soon. Beyond the last of the soldiers, a river ran off south and west, the Rysandrella, 20 paces wide and flanked on either side by hard-baked mud studded with stones. Swirling around rocks that might have made crossing hazardous in other days, the water rose short of the horses' knees as they forded. Egwene felt her own problems dwindle in size. Despite her head, she offered a small prayer for Nynaeve and Elaine. Their search was as important as anything she did. More. The world would live if she failed, but they had to succeed. They traveled southward at an easy canter, slowing when the hillside slant of the land grew too great, or the horses had to climb any distance through trees and sparse scrub, but keeping to the lowland as much as possible and covering ground quickly. Bryn's big-nosed gelding, sure-footed and strong, hardly seemed to mind which way the ground tilted, or whether smooth or rough, yet Daishar kept pace easily. Sometimes Swan's plump animal labored, though she might just have been picking up her rider's anxiety. No amount of practice could make Swan anything but a terrible rider, nearly throwing her arms around the mare's neck, climbing upslope, almost falling from the saddle going down, awkward as a duck afoot on the flats, and not far from wide-eyed as the horse. Mirella actually regained some of her humor watching Swan. Her own white-footed sorrel picked her way in delicate swoops like a swallow, and Mirella rode with an assurance and flair that made Bryn appear stolid and workmanlike. Before they had gone very far, riders appeared atop a high ridge to the west, perhaps 100 men in column, the rising sun glinting off breastplates and helmets and lance points. At their head streamed a long white pennant Egwene could not make out, but she knew it bore the red hand. She had not expected to see them so close to the Aes Sedai camp. Dragon-sworn animals, Mirella muttered, watching the horsemen parallel their route. Her gloved hands tightened on her reins, with fury, not fear. The band of the Red Hand puts out patrols, Bryn said placidly. With a glance at Egwene, he added, Lord Talmanas seems concerned about you, Mother. I spoke to him. He put no more emphasis on that than the other. You've spoken with him? Every vestige of Mirella's serenity vanished. The anger she had to hold in with Egwene she could safely unleash on him. She all but shook with it. That is very close to treason, Lord Bryn. It might well be treason. Swan had been dividing her attention between her horse and the men on the ridge, and she did not look at Mirella, but she stiffened. No one had tied the band and treason together before. They rounded a bend in the hill valley. A farm clung to a hillside, or what had been a farm once. One wall of the small stone house had collapsed, and a few charred timbers stuck up beside the soot-coated chimney like grimy fingers. The roofless barn was a blackened hollow box of stone, and scattered ash marked where sheds might once have stood. All across Altara they had seen as bad and worse, entire villages sometimes, the dead lying in the streets, food for ravens and foxes and feral dogs that fled when people came close. Stories of anarchy and murder in Tarabon and Arad Doman suddenly had flesh and bones. Many men seized any excuse to turn bandit or settle old grudges. Egwene hoped fervently it was so. But the name on every survivor's lips was dragon-sworn, and the sisters blamed him as surely as if he had carried the torches himself. They would use him still if they could, though, control him if they found a way. She was not the only Aes Sedai to believe in doing what she must, even when she had to hold her nose. Mirella's anger affected Bryn as little as rain affected a boulder. Egwene had a sudden image of storms whirling about his head and floodwaters swirling around his knees while he just kept striding ahead. Mirella Sedai, he said with the calm she should have known. When 10,000 men or more are shadowing my back trail, I want to know what their intentions are, especially this particular 10,000 or more. This was a dangerous topic. However happy Egwene was that they were past questions of Talmana's concern over her, she should have been grinding her teeth that he had mentioned her at all, but she was so startled she sat bolt upright in her saddle. 10,000? Are you sure? The band had had little more than half that when Matt brought it to Salidar, hunting her and Elaine. Bryn merely shrugged. I gather recruits as I go, and so does he. Not as many, but some men have notions about serving Aes Sedai. More people than not would have been distinctly uneasy, saying that to three sisters. He said it with a wry smile. Besides, it seems the band has a certain reputation from the fighting in Cairhien. The tale is, Shen and Kalhar never loses, whatever the odds. That was what drove men to join, here as back in Altara. the thought that two armies must mean a battle. Trying to stand aside might end as hard as choosing the wrong side. At
Excuse
best,
me.
there would be no pickings for neutrals. I've had a few deserters to my ranks from Talmanos's newlings. Some seem to think the band's luck is tied up in Matt Cawthorn and can't be there without him. Something close to a sneer twisted Mirella's lips. These fool Mirandians' fears are certainly useful, but I did not think you were a fool too. Talmanos follows us because he fears we might turn against his precious Lord Dragon. But if he truly intended to attack, don't you think he would have by now? These dragons sworn can be dealt with once more important matters are done. Communicating with him, however. Giving herself a shake, she managed to regain her serenity, on the surface at least. Her tone could still have scorched her. You mock me, Lord Bryn. Egwene let Mirella's words pass her by. Bryn had looked at her when he mentioned Matt. The sisters thought they knew the situation with the band and Matt, and did not think on it much, but Bryn apparently did. Tilting her head so the brim of her hat obscured her face, she studied him from the corner of her eye. He was oath-bound to build the army and lead it until Elida was brought down. But why had he sworn? Surely he could have found some lesser oath, and it surely would have been accepted by sisters who only thought to use all those soldiers as a full-day mask to frighten Elida. Having him on their side was comforting. Even the other Aes Sedai seemed to feel that. Like her father, he was the sort of man who made you believe there was no cause for panic, whatever the situation. Having him oppose her, she realized suddenly, might be as bad as having the Hall against her, and never mind the army. The one approving comment Swan had ever had of him was that he was formidable, even if she did try to change the remark immediately to mean something else. Any man Swan Sanchez thought formidable was one to be mindful of. They splashed across a tiny stream, a rivulet that barely wet the horse's hooves. A bedraggled crow, feeding on a fish that had stranded itself in water too shallow to swim, fluttered its tattered wings on the edge of flight, then settled back to its meal. Swan was also studying Bryn. The mare made much easier going when she forgot to saw at the reins or dig her heels in at just the wrong moment. Egwene had asked her about Lord Bryn's motives, but Swan's own tangled connection to the man left her little except acid when it came to him. She either hated Gareth Bryn to his boot soles or loved him, and imagining Swan in love was like imagining that crow swimming. The ridgeline where the band's soldiers had been showed only cockeyed lines of dead conifers now. She had not noticed them going. Matt had a reputation as a soldier. Crows really did not come close. She had believed he commanded only because of land, and that had been hard enough to swallow. Believing because you think you know is dangerous, she reminded herself, eyeing Bryn. Should be flogged. Mirella's voice still burned. I warn you, if I hear that you've met with this dragon sworn again. Rain washing over that boulder, as far as Bryn was concerned, or so it seemed. He rode easily, occasionally murmuring, "Yes, Mirella Sedai," or "No, Mirella Sedai," without any hint of distress, and without lessening the watch he kept on the countryside. No doubt he had seen the soldiers leave. However he mustered the patience, Egwene was sure fear was no part of it. She was in no mood to listen to that. Be quiet, Mirella. No one is going to do anything to Lord Bryn. Rubbing her temple, she thought of asking one of the sisters back in the camp for healing. Neither Swan nor Mirella had much ability there. Not that healing would do any good if it was just lack of sleep and worry. Not that she wanted whispers spreading that the strain was growing too great for her. Besides, there were other ways to deal with headaches than healing, although not here. Mirella's mouth tightened only for an instant. With a toss of her head, she turned her face away, color in her cheeks, and Bryn suddenly appeared absorbed in examining a red-winged hawk, wheeling off to their left. Even a brave man could know when to be discreet. Folding its wings, the hawk plummeted toward unseen prey behind a stand of bedraggled leather leaves. Egwene felt that way, swooping on targets she could not see, hoping she had chosen the right one, hoping there was a target there. She drew breath, wishing it were steadier. Just the same, Lord Bryn, I think it's best you don't meet Talmanos again. Surely you know as much of his intentions as you need by this time? Light Sen Talmanis had not said too much already. A pity she could not send Swan or Liana to caution him if he would take it, but given feelings among the sisters, she might as well risk going to see Rand. Bryn bowed in his saddle. As you command, mother. There was no mockery in his tone. There never was. He had obviously learned to school his voice around Aes Sedai. Swan hung back, frowning at him. Perhaps she could dig out where his loyalties lay. For all her animosity, she spent a great deal of time in his company, much more than she absolutely had to. With an effort, Egwene kept her hands on Daishar's reins, away from her head. How much further, Lord Bryn? Keeping impatience from her voice was more difficult. Just a little way, mother. For some reason, he halfway turned his head to look at Mirella. Not far now. Increasingly, farms dotted the region, as many clinging to hillsides as on the flats, though the Emmons fielder in Egwene said that made no sense. Low gray stone houses and barns, and unfenced pastures with a few slat-ribbed cows and sad-looking black-tailed sheep. Not all had been burned by far, only one here and one there. Supposedly the burnings were to let the others know what would happen if they did not declare for the Dragon Reborn. At one farm she saw some of Lord Bryn's foragers with a wagon. That they were his was plain as much by the way he eyed them and nodded as by the lack of a white pennant. The band always flaunted itself. Aside from the banners, some had of late taken to wearing a red scarf tied around the arm. Half a dozen cattle and maybe 24 sheep lowed and baaed under the guard of men on horseback, and other men toted sacks from barn to wagon past a slump-shouldered farmer and his family, a sullen lot in dark, rough woolens. One of the little girls, wearing a deep bonnet like the others, had her face pressed to her mother's skirts, apparently crying. Some of the boys had their fists clenched, as if they wanted to fight. The farmer would be paid, but if he could not really spare what was taken, if he had had a mind to resist close on 20 men in breastplates and helmets, those burned farms would have given him pause. Quite often Bryn's soldiers found charred corpses in the ruins, men, women, and children who had died trying to get out. Sometimes the doors and windows had been sealed up from outside. Egwene wondered whether there was any way to convince the farmers and villagers that there was a difference between the brigands and the army. She wanted to, very much, but she did not see how, short of letting her own soldiers go hungry until they deserted. If the sisters could see no difference between the brigands and the band, there seemed no hope for the country folk. As the farm dwindled behind them, she resisted the urge to twist around in her saddle and look back. Looking would change nothing. Lord Bryn was as good as his word. Perhaps 3 or 4 miles from the camp, 3 or 4 in a straight line, twice that over the country they had crossed, they rounded the shoulder of a hill spotted with brush and trees, and he drew rein. The sun stood almost halfway to its crest now. Another road ran below, narrower and much more winding than the one through the camp. They had the idea traveling by night would take them safe past the bandits, he said. Not a bad notion, as it turns out, or else they've just had the Dark One's own luck. They've come from Camelin. A merchant train of some 50 large wagons behind teams of 10 or so lay stretched out along the road, halted under the eyes of more of Bryn's soldiers. A few of the soldiers were afoot, supervising the transfer of barrels and bags from the merchants' wagons to half a dozen of their own. One woman in a plain dark dress waved her arms and pointed vigorously to this item or that, either protesting or bargaining, but her fellows stood in a glum, silent knot. A short way farther up the road, grim fruit decorated the spreading limbs of an oak, men hanging by the neck from every bare branch. Bare except for crows, almost enough to make the tree seem leaved in black. They had larger-than-fish to feed on, these birds. Even at a distance, it was not a sight to ease Egwene's head or her stomach. This what you wanted me to see? The merchants or the bandits? She could not see a dress on any of those dangling corpses, and when the bandits hanged people, they included women and children. Anyone could have put the corpses there, Bryn's soldiers, the band. That the band hanged any of the so-called dragon swarm they caught made little difference to the sisters, or even some local lord or lady. Had the Murandian nobles worked together, all the brigands might have hung from trees by now, but that was like asking cats to dance. Wait, he had said Camelin. Is it something to do with Rand? Or the Ashaman? This time he looked from her to Mirella and back quite openly. Mirella's hat cast shadows on her face. She appeared sunk in gloom, sagging in her saddle, and not at all the confident rider she had been earlier. He seemed to reach a decision. I thought you should hear before anybody else did, but perhaps I misunderstood. He eyed Mirella again. Hear what, you hairy-eared lump? Swan growled, thumping the fat mare closer with her heels. Egwene made a soothing gesture toward her. Mirella can hear anything I do, Lord Bryn. She has my complete trust. The Green Sister's head jerked around. From her stricken look, anyone would doubt they had heard Egwene correctly, but after a moment Bryn nodded. I see that matters have changed. Yes, Mother. Removing his helmet, he set it on the pommel of his saddle. He still seemed reluctant, picking his words with care. Merchants carry rumors the way dogs do fleas, and that lot down there has a fine crop. I don't say any of it is true, of course, but it was odd seeing him so hesitant. Mother, one tale that caught them up on the road is that Randall Thor has gone to the White Tower and sworn fealty to Elida. For a moment, Mirella and Swan looked much alike, blood draining from their faces as they envisioned catastrophe. Mirella actually swayed in her saddle. For a moment, Egwene could only stare at him. Then she startled herself and the others by bursting out laughing. Dishart danced in surprise, and settling him on the rocky slope settled her nerves as well. Lord Bryn, she said, patting the gelding's neck, that isn't so, believe me. I know it for a fact, as of last night. Swan heaved an instant sigh, and Mirella was only a heartbeat behind. Egwene felt like laughing again at their expressions. So incredibly relieved they were wide-eyed. Children who had been told the Shadow Man was not under the bed. Aes Sedai calm indeed. That's good to hear, Bryn said flatly. But even if I sent away every man down there, the tale will still reach my ranks. It will go through the army like wildfire crossing these hills. That cut her mirth short. That could be disaster left alone. I will have sisters announce the truth to your soldiers tomorrow. Will 6 Aes Sedai who know of themselves be enough? Mirella here and Shiriam, Carlinia and Beonin, Anaya and Morvrin? Those sisters would not like having to meet with the wise ones, but they would not be able to refuse her either. Would not want to, really, to stop this tale spreading. Should not want to, at least. Mirella's tiny wince was followed by a resigned twist of her mouth. Leaning an elbow on his helmet, Bryn studied Egwene and Mirella. He never so much as peeked at Swan. His bay stamped a hoof on the rock, and a covey of some sort of dove with bright blue wings whirred into the air from beneath bushes a few paces away, making Daishar and Mirella's roan start skittishly. Bryn's mount did not stir. He had heard of the gateways, without doubt, though he surely knew nothing of what they were. Aes Sedai did keep secrets by habit, and had some hope of keeping that one from Elida, and he certainly knew nothing at all about Tel'aran Riod. That vital secret was easier to guard with no manifestations anyone could see, yet he did not ask how. Perhaps he was accustomed to Aes Sedai and secrets by now. So long as they say the word straight, he said at last. If they hedge even a hair. His stare was not an attempt to intimidate, just to drive the point home. He seemed satisfied by what he saw in her face. You do very well, it appears, Mother. I wish you continued success. Set your time for this afternoon, and I will come. We should confer regularly. I will come whenever you send for me. We should...
Alright, everyone, gonna call into this live for tonight. Excuse me. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by and chill. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.